Welcome to the Code for Couples podcast, focusing on topics for law enforcement officers and couples to keep you and your relationship connected, resilient, and code for. Now, your host, law enforcement expert Cindy Doyle, author of Hold the Line and My Wife.
Hey there, welcome back to Code for Couples. I'm your host, Cindy Doyle, licensed professional counselor, LEO wife, and author of Hold the Line, How to Protect Your Law Enforcement Relationship. Today, I have Elizabeth Ecklund on, and she is with Mind Forge Therapy. And funny story there, when I started looking her up, I put Mind Forget Therapy, and I thought maybe that's not right. It wasn't. So Mind Forge Therapy. She uses her 15 years of experience as a firefighter, EMT, and a nurse to impact first responders. Most recently, as of 2024, get this, she worked in Antarctica as an airport rescue firefighter for the NSF at both Mercado and South Pole, Antarctica. She is also passionate about mental health and impacting her first responder community. Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming on. I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation about a lot of different things. I know I told you before we started recording that my admin and I saw the Antarctica and we were like, what? Tell us more. But thank you for coming on to talk to us today about all the things we're going to talk about.
Very, very welcome. I'm very happy to be here.
I know we want to talk a little bit about Antarctica, but you are also a dual first responder couple. And I know you are passionate about balance in our lives. So those are kind of all the things that we're going to hit today. But tell us a little bit about, I want to know how you were inspired to become a first responder, especially in such a unique way, right? You've done a lot and you're married to one as well. So how were you inspired to become a first responder?
Really, really long question. I have a really long answer for that question, but
Okay.
one version is that I actually did not grow up with anyone around me who was a first responder. My family actually works in law. So I started out as a legal secretary who became a paralegal for my mother's business in Alaska, and then ended up eventually transitioning where a friend of mine who is a female firefighter said, hey, come join the fire department. And I thought, well, I have no idea what firefighters do. I don't know. That's never exactly been on my radar. So the first step for me was I joined a volunteer department to try to get an idea if I liked it, which when I figured I did, I really enjoyed it. I ended up going to a fire academy in San Antonio, Texas, and received my IFSAC designations, and ended up also going to school for my EMT, which thank you Fort Campbell for adopting me in their medic program. And
wow.
I was able to go and take my EMT classes alongside my husband, who was an 18 Delta Special Forces medic at the time. And so they allowed us to go and take the class together. And the funny story about the medic class is that most military medics, even by the time they get into the EMT class, they have already learned how to do an IV. And I was the one student in the class that not only did not like needles, I had never done an IV. And so my husband very kindly offered to be the first person that I inserted the IV in his AC and looked at everybody as blood was coming out and said, what next? Because they'll told me the next step. And so anyway, to this day, that is the biggest story joke we have about the EMT class. And so I've been fortunate to be invited to military classes, to a big portion of my education, even though I was a spouse and not a military service member.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of friends who are in the industry who welcomed me in, showed me the ropes. So that's how I got my start.
Jeez Louise. And also you're a nurse, and also you're now finishing up your licensure to be a clinical social worker. And so I'm like, you obviously believe in education and learning and challenging and growing. I can definitely see that for sure. My gosh. And how long have y'all been married?
I will be married 20 years this
Oh my
October.
gosh. Well, congratulations. Wow, wow,
You,
wow. So
you.
you come at this from so many different angles in the sense that, my audience is first responders, spouses. And so you come at this in a couple different angles from a first responder, also as a spouse, and doing things together. I know before we started recording, also, you talked about, I'm going to call it your tour. I don't know if that's the right word in Antarctica. And you were telling me a little bit about that and how your husband went down in one, like the summer, the winter, and then y'all flip flopped or something.
Right.
What were you doing in Antarctica?
So when my husband retired his 30-year service with the military, he actually finished out as a physician assistant. So he ended up taking a contract with UTMB, which again, University of Texas Medical Branch, provides medical services down in Antarctica. So he went as a physician assistant. And how he approached me is he said, "Hey, I'm interested in doing this thing and you're going to be in graduate school. So could I go for the 9 months?" And of course, I was taken back a little bit because I was like, we just finished military,
Yeah.
years and all these deployments. So at first I was a little bit taken back by it, but then he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll sweeten the deal. I'll kind of give you some money to help. So maybe you can not necessarily work as much while you're in graduate school." And I thought, okay, bye, love you. Well,
See ya.
right. So he ended up going for 9 months, which of course, in my mind, 9 months in Antarctica in winter is difficult. That's the time of
I would think so. Yeah.
a time of year that it is dark and it's
Hmm.
cold. They have a lot of storms. So it's not ideal for me. I particularly like to be outside most of the time. So for me, I thought, well, that would just sort of keep you hunkered down, And so my husband is a little bit different than I am, that he enjoys being inside. He is very much entertained with like board games or video games. And so he's he can handle that. So he ended up going and he did 9 months. And then when he
Okay.
came back and I finished graduate school, I opened my practice and I applied to go, but I applied as a firefighter. Now, mind you, I hadn't been working in career fire service for about 10 years. So it was one of those, I'll apply. If they take me, I'll go. But if they don't, at least I won't regret that I didn't attempt it. And so I applied, I went through the process and they accepted me. And it's not an easy process. As you can imagine, you do have to physically qualify to go. There's a lot of tests that you have to do. You have to be in good health. You
Hmm.
can be on lots of medications. And so they ended up accepting me and I ended up having to go recertify some of my fire certs and then ended up going down. So
Wow.
I chose to do summer. And then while I was there, they asked me mid-tour if I would consider going to South Pole because South Pole is much harder to physically qualify for. And apparently the firefighter that they had initially chosen for that tour was not able to qualify. So they ended up sending me and I got to experience both McMurdo and South Pole, which that was my one bragging right with my husband was that he would have loved to go to South Pole, but they didn't have
Yeah.
opportunity for him. So I got to say, haha, I got to go to both. And
Oh, wow.
and the
What
competitive.
an experience, though, to be able to do that. And what a compliment to go, well, you're in better health. And so we're going to send you because you're better qualified and you're in better health. That says a lot. Wow. When you think of, he was in the military for 30 years, you said. And as a first responder, I have to imagine that y'all had a pretty stressful life as a couple with his career and your career, both of you serving in some capacity. What were some of the stressors that were difficult for y'all?
I would say that first of all, my upbringing is both my parents were in the Navy.
Okay.
So I feel like there was a lot of sense of normalcy for me, which maybe other couples may not necessarily experience depending, on their upbringing. And for
Mhm.
me, I was used to my mom or my dad sort of being gone here and there. So initially, that didn't feel much different than what I was used to growing
Growing up. Right.
but at the same time, yes, we were married. I was married in my early 20s. So moving from everything that I had known in Alaska, which I mean, if anybody listening to this knows anything about Alaska, we have like one main highway.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different. And my very first duty station with my husband was Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And just to tell you how inexperienced and naive I was, I remember driving on the highway, right? And thinking you'd see a sign that would say, this exit 10 miles, whatever town, right? I thought if I literally pulled off on that exit, I was in that town. Because in the
You
when
are.
you don't sign, right, Eagle River, you pull off, you're in Eagle River. And so there is a lot of difference. There was a lot of things that I had to learn
Mm.
from that environment to, coming from Alaska to what we call lower 48.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of that. Otherwise, I would say I I think I experience stress the way most couples experience stress, which is, we don't like it when we don't know when our partner is deploying or when they're going to be home. And then having those things change left and right, day and night, that kind of thing. It happens very frequently. That's stressful for everybody involved.
Yeah. I was kind of wondering too if he worried about you, if he's deployed and you're in a very active, potentially dangerous situation yourself, if he ever expressed any concern, especially when he was gone.
I would say my husband expressed concern usually through what other people were saying to him. Like, how do you let your wife,
That's funny.
in the fire department? And, one of the stations that I worked in Kentucky was like a big bay, and I was the only female. And so the guys are very respectful, and everybody has like their own bed, but, you're kind of in your own spot.
Mm-hmm.
My husband knew that I would like sleep in this room where there are all these different my coworkers, but usually it was his coworkers that were bringing up that they were, how do you handle that? How do you, and my husband was sort of like, well, I know my wife and
Good for him.
she's not, you're right. So I think I was very fortunate. And I think a part of our marriage and our life and our story growing up was that we didn't have, dating apps like we have now, right?
Right.
No,
Yes.
we actually met as actors in a Renaissance fair. That's how we met. So-
What?
Right.
That is awesome. Actors at a Renaissance festival. That is awesome. Okay.
In Alaska, Anchorage. Yes, that's how we met. And so we knew each other for years as friends before we were ever anything else. My husband is 8 years older than I am. So we actually knew each other where I remember him dating other girls and other girls telling me stories about him before he and I ever even thought about dating. So it's one of those things that we had a very solid friendship before we got married. And I think that speaks highly. And I feel like it's more difficult in this day and age to get that friendship first. And that has to do a lot with social media and dating apps.
Oh, yeah.
How do we meet people? How do we make friends? Right?
Mhm.
So these are a lot of
Yeah, it's so true in regard to that. And I think it's when you're talking about the relationship, sometimes as first responder couples, we are fine with our significant other, spouse, whoever it is, right? That's out in the field. We like people have said, well, how do you do it? I don't know any other way. it's the only way I've been in a marriage, and so it's the only way that I know. I sometimes I'm like, "How do you have dinner with him every night? That must be like, that gets old, doesn't it?" Like, we get to have these reunions where I haven't seen him for a while, and it's like, "Oh, yeah, we make up for lost time, wink, wink, nudge, nudge," right? But and so part of it is, like, when other people are like, "Well, how do you trust?" And your husband knew you well enough, and obviously y'all have an incredible friendship, but also a lot of trust to be able to move through that and kind of poo-poo those people that were trying to insert those seeds of doubt in the relationship. So, good. I know you are really passionate about balancing professional and personal life, which, talking to you a little bit, there's so much professionally there. We haven't even really talked about personal life, but I know it's something that you're passionate about. What did you find was hard for you, and what way did you struggle to find that balance between professional and personal life?
That's a great question. So I think what happened was that I actually looked into starting some therapy years ago. This is again when I was a nurse coming through COVID. I know a lot of us were,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
And there was a lot of struggle there, and not necessarily in my marriage. I just want to say my marriage felt very good. I'm very, again, very fortunate through COVID. We were doing well, but professionally there was a lot of struggle. And I think a lot of people had a lot of struggle during COVID, right? And so
yes.
this was one of the few times that and again, came from a background where a lot of us do, which is, I don't we don't like therapy. That's weakness if you go and talk to some stranger. These are not things
Mhm,
you would normally do. But I got to the point where I I needed to have somebody along for the ride. And I ended up going and talking to a therapist, and that in itself changed a lot of my perspective. It made me realize that I didn't know that much about myself. The things
mm,
we we focus on day to day. Generally, we don't sit and think about who I am and what are my values and what's not working, right? Because a lot of times what's happening is when our professional life is no longer aligned with our personal values, that's where we start having a lot of that internal dialogue that doesn't feel very good, right? That's that arguing, like what is happening and I don't like my job, but I have to go to my job, but also there's all this stuff that happens, right? And so during COVID, I went through that and I worked with a therapist, and the therapist helped me to understand that there were a lot of things that weren't in alignment. And so, of course, after that, and again, I'm very fortunate. I have very supportive family. My little sister's actually getting her PhD in psychology right now, too.
Oh, wow.
I don't- right.
Okay.
And so she had sort of talked to me about some things that she felt like she was seeing. And she'd also been talking to me about social work for many years because there were quite a few things that I've done that felt very much like social work. And so, again, worked as an RN, worked as case manager
Mm,
in home health and that kind of thing. So I was performing a lot of the services that a social worker would perform, especially when we didn't have one at times. So anyway, it just so happened that I personally experienced this where I was out of alignment with things. My life wasn't aligned. My values weren't aligned. My balance wasn't there, right? And so I ended up, and here I am kind of thing. I ended up changing my career. I changed a lot of things, and it took a lot of work mentally. And again, having a good therapist help with that process to come to the conclusion that I needed to make another change so that my values were in line. And then once that happened, once those things started to fall in line, it made it much clearer, much easier for me to have the balance that I needed. But the first step is getting to know who you are. It's having that understanding of what your values are and what your priorities are. Because if your priorities are, of course, you and your values, which I'm going
mhm.
to say the unpopular opinion, but it should be. because without you, there is nobody else, right? I can't take
Right.
care of
Right.
my family.
Yeah.
I can't take care of my spouse. I can't take care of my job. So I had to figure out what was important to me and what time I needed and those goals that I have. How do I obtain those goals that are outside of work, right? What do I want to do with my life? What do I want to do with myself? And once those things started to come into focus, the second priority was my spouse, right? My family.
Mm.
How do I show up for my partner? But also, the big part of this is talking to your partner and finding out how do they feel valued, right? How much time do they need from you as a partner? Because if I said, for example, I need a date night once a month. My husband and I want us to go to a movie at least once a month where it's just us, and that makes me happy. But if I just start to do that and I plan this once a month with him, and all of a sudden my partner feels like he's still not getting what he needs because I haven't asked him, right? And maybe
Oh,
I get him and I say, hey, what do you need? What do you need to feel like a priority in this relationship? And he says, hey, I need one night a week. Right? So me doing the once a month, even though in my mind that seemed like enough.
ain't
No,
cutting it.
right. So
Yeah.
that's why communication is important. But also, like I like to stress in this whole equation is you have to know what you want, and your partner also needs to know what you want. I'm sure everybody can say they've been on the receiving end of a bad gift, right? Valentine's Day, I actually had a client who came to me and was very upset because her husband had not done X, Y, and Z for Valentine's Day.
Mm.
And I said to her, well, did you communicate that you wanted that? And she was like, well, no, but also I didn't know that I really wanted that until after the fact. So the husband had attempted and brought her, like the standard teddy bear and chocolate kind of thing. But what she wanted was like a date night away from their twins and a nice dinner. And that's what she wanted. But initially, she couldn't even verbalize what she wanted. And then after she figured out what she wanted, she was resentful of the gift that he had given her. But
Yeah.
she realized it wasn't exactly his fault because he didn't know what she wanted. Right. And sorry.
So, no, it's okay. So it's really important. So when we're finding that balance, first of all, recognizing that we're out of balance, whether that's complaining, whether that's like not being in touch with ourselves, feeling disconnected in some way. But then that first step is really understanding what our values are. What are we wanting? What do we need? And I love that second part is not just like, well, and everybody else has to deal with it. Right. So then that second part that you're saying is you have to learn to communicate what those values are and what you think you want and see if it matches up with your spouse and your family because they will have just clapped because they will have needs too. And so I love the example that you gave of like if your husband's needing connection or to have a date night once a week and you're like fine once a month, which by the way, I think, we could change that into sex and that would probably impact a lot of relationships here, right? It's like, well, if you're fine with sex twice a month but your spouse is wanting it twice a week, then and that's how they feel connected. Those values and those conversations when we're looking at our own balance between professional and personal life, we're needing to have those conversations with our significant others or with our partners, spouses, whoever it is as well. Yeah.
Because even if balance to you is I work 20 to 40 hours a week and then, I'm home on the weekend, that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
that may not be balance for your partner. And if your partner, they're your priority in your life, right? Then they need to be a part of that conversation. And there may need to be some expectations that are, either yours or theirs or both that you guys have to compromise on, right? Healthy relationship, a lot of compromise. But you have to have these conversations. And I just don't know how to.
Yeah, that really plays out just really quickly. That really plays out. I mean, you were talking about deployments, right? He came to you and he said, so I'm thinking about going for 9 months and he negotiated, right, for that. But I'm thinking what hit me was a lot of times how departments or agencies right now are really undermanned, understaffed. And so there's the demand and or opportunity to work overtime or to work off duty types of jobs. But at the same time, sometimes if you're saying your values are your family, that might butt up against things. Or, as a couple, do one of you value financial security and the other one values family? Or where does financial security and family, like, how does that marry up? And so having those conversations, I was just thinking of that one in particular, having those conversations are really important because yes, financial security is great, but is it great if it's at the cost of the family, which is really a bigger value for you?
Right.
Wow, because that's that conflict between professional and personal, I think. Yeah, for
Right. And
sure.
I understand that with the fire department, with, working as a police officer, things like that, a lot of those departments can be where they're going to demand a lot of your personal attention, right? I know as nurses, we have a little more flexibility. Nursing is always short, but nursing is less competitive as opposed to when I worked at a fire department, right? Fire departments are very competitive and difficult to get on. And then once you get
Yeah,
on, you feel like you need to say yes to everything, right? And maybe in the beginning, we do need to say yes. But after a while, we need to be able to put more of our focus into the things that we prioritize. Because I don't know too many of us that are, we're here living to work. We want to work to live, right?
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so there is a way to make it all work. But it's having these conversations and it's having conversations with potentially even your department, with your family, right? Figuring out compromises for each thing, making sure that we're getting our goals and our family's goals, all these things in as well as our department's goals. And I hate to say it, but ultimately if your priority is your family and we can't make our job work, there are other departments. There are
Yes.
things we can do. But unfortunately, it's hard to replace our families. It's hard to replace, especially if they are our priority, right?
Yeah,
So,
and not only that, but the thing is that your department's not going to be there in your retirement,
right,
right? So your family is, and so that's why it's important to consider where does that balance between that professional and personal life come in.
right.
I know you have kind of, I'm going to call them three pillars that you have or that you've talked about before about balancing that personal and professional life. And the first one I think you had was about stress mitigation.
So with the stress mitigation component, you want to, again, it's figuring out what your value system is, right?
Mhm.
And understanding what you need. So for me, I always joke, I call my Sundays my human vegetable day. I have some
Oh,
clients where they call that they call it rotting. And so
yes.
I say, okay, so rotting. I know for me, I need to have one day, probably every week or every other week, where I may not get out of my pajamas kind of thing. I need that day. And it took me a long time, by the way, it took me a long time to get to this point because as an A type person, rest wasn't something that I necessarily value, right? I'm kind of
Mhm.
I had those internal conflicts too, where it's like, but you're not doing something. You're not doing something. You need to be doing something, right? But the reality is I am doing something. It's called resting.
Yeah.
When I
Mm.
rest, I'm able to carry on doing what I need to do and showing up for my clients the way they need me to throughout the week. If I don't have that day, it shows up. It shows up that I didn't have that rest.
Yeah.
So again, it's a part of learning who you are, what your values are, and what you need. And that's what I learned. I need to have one day every week, if not every other week, where I turn off, my phone. If I want to Netflix and chill, I want to, you know what I'm saying? And I have
Mhm.
to learned that that has value for me. And I do that, and it makes a huge difference. My husband actually, he takes every Sunday and he goes and has like a group that he games with. So that's how he recharges, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. And I'm supportive of his recharge and he's supportive of my recharge because we've learned that when we have that recharge, we are definitely a better couple as well, right? We're able to then get
Yeah.
together and be like, okay, you had your space and your time. And he and I both are, I would say, both pretty introverted, and we like also alone time for recharging. So we have recognized that in each other and we give each other that space.
That's another really important conversation you have to have as a couple, I hear too, because you brought up a couple different issues. One, if you rest, I'm going to say that differently, but expect your spouse to rest the same way, that could be a problem. I'm married to an extrovert. I am actually an introvert, and my husband does better when he goes and hangs out with people. I find it exhausting. I can do it for a while and then I'm like, I'm done. But I do it because he needs it. And then I also need to, sit on the couch. I actually sit at the computer and like do nerdy things, or, watch TV or whatever. But so that's one communication. I think the other one is you're talking about time too, because with families, different people have different priorities. And so if talking about that value of rest and how do you recharge might involve somebody taking the kids or
Right.
being relieved of the kids, right? Or family of some way. So those are two really important conversations that go along with making sure that stress is taken care of on both aspects.
Right. Exactly. And I do have quite a few clients who are parents. And that's the thing is
Mhm.
they have had to have those conversations. Who can take the kid? Or remember I said I might need every other week. So
Right.
some my couples will choose, this week dad takes kids on one day and then next week mom takes kids so that dad can recharge. And it's figuring out what you need. And then,
Mhm.
and I mean, I know I've said that many times, this conversation.
That's okay. That's okay. It's reiterating, right?
Right.
And
And
so then go ahead.
I would say, I think the hardest thing of this whole story is actually not necessarily the communicating it to your partner. It's the figuring
Mm.
out what it is. And also being understanding that it can change, right? We're human, we change, we grow. So just because I might need one day every week or every other week right now, that might look different down the road, especially if my work schedule changes or maybe, we retire at some point and then I'm not necessarily going to need every day or every week.
Exactly.
Something things change, right? So
Right.
being okay with these ideas being a little bit flexible. And I bring that up because one partner might say, hey, I need one day a week, but then later that's going to change, right? They might then
Mhm.
actually what I need is this. And that's okay because again, we change, we grow. Our needs are going to change and grow as well.
Absolutely. It kind of leads into all of this conversation about like how do we communicate as a couple, kind of leads into that second one that you have, which is kind of strengthening. It's not kind of the second one that you have, which is strengthening the family bonds, was your next step or that kind of pillar that you had. And talking about, we've talked through this whole entire time about, is family a priority? Do you have that value there? So talk more about that one.
Sure. So again, this is where we need to have a conversation with our family members, right? We need to say, hey, this is what I want and what I need. What is it you want and what is it you need? And that's
Mm.
where we manage expectations, right? My biggest joke with that is, for example, if I said my mom is a priority in my life, right? I want my mom as extended family, she's a priority. My mother would probably love to have a phone call with me every day if she could have a phone call with me every day, right? But for me, that would be very overwhelming. And as much as I love her, having a phone call maybe every 2 weeks or even once a month is more than enough for me. So having a conversation where we're managing expectations. Well, I love you, but I can't call you every day because I work and I do these different things. But I will try to make, a priority I will try to show up for you by calling you once every 2 weeks. Right. And again, she may not love that, but she might be able to say, okay, I understand that you are, running a practice and that you are married and that you have other, right. And so it's being able to have that communication, managing expectations, but also trying to find a compromise where you can find one. And so, again, I think where partners fail in this is, again, they decide I can give you this time, but they don't communicate that to the partner and they don't allow the partner to have a chance to say, that might not be enough for me.
Mm.
Right. And you kind of started to talk a little bit about like the sex aspect or like love languages. What is your partner's love language? What is it they need? How do they see or feel love? Right. Having those conversations. I think that's important. So
Yeah. It's the theme throughout this whole entire thing is know yourself, communicate that, compromise, and figure out how you can help each other. It's really that balance is not, when I went into this conversation with you, I was kind of like, oh, this is a solo activity. I have to find my balance between my professional and personal life. But really, this is kind of like how do we do this? How do I get support in finding that balance? And it's not just a solo activity.
no,
It's
not. No.
very much a couple or a family activity.
And I'm in the
Yeah.
middle of my Gottman's couple training right now. So
Sure.
I've been mostly an individual therapist. But what I will say is that, and I recognize this from the get-go, that
Mhm.
one partner shows up and says, hey, my relationship is a problem and blah, 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 for several sessions that my relationship is a problem. The answer is we can't fix the problem without having both partners involved, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what's interesting about the Gottman couples training that's been very eye-opening even for me as a clinician is this idea that when you go into couples counseling, both partners are given, the equal opportunity and there can't be secrets where
Mhm.
in individual therapy, anything you say to me is completely 100% confidential, right? But when it comes to couples, you don't get that confidentiality. I'm there to support both partners, right?
Mhm.
But there can't be secrets between us.
And it kind of bleeds over into, as you're listening to this, guys, you're kind of hearing that what she's telling you is like, hey, don't do this as a solo activity. Do this as a part of a whole, is kind of what I hear you saying. Like having these secrets and not communicating is already something that I think as first responder couples we struggle with a lot of times, as law enforcement couples too. Like we struggle with finding time to have those important conversations. And it's what I hear is when you're talking about balance, that those conversations with the people that are in your family are vital to maintaining that balance of that professional and personal life, which will keep you out of that burnout. So part of the burnout prevention is having, not just knowing ourselves, but having those conversations on an ongoing basis. One of my podcasts that I recently did talks about how to have emotional safety at home. And I think that's what you're leaning into too, was kind of that emotional availability
Right.
for each other. Like if you have those communications, do you want to talk more about that emotional availability part?
Yes. So I think a big part of emotional availability is also having the vocabulary to even talk about our emotions, right? Because I think there was some study that they did and most people only know, happy and sad and angry, right? You've heard this.
Yeah, so that's the guy from, I want to say it was Berkeley, but it's the guy from who was the consultant in Inside Out. And it was his research. And that research said that yes, most Americans know 3 emotions. And so that emotional vocabulary is not there. Yeah.
And
So
I would joke, I would say that most first responders, it's, happy and mad, right? Because we we are not taught to be to us, and again, there's a lot of research that goes into why this is, right? We could go all the way back into like, our relatives and World War II veterans and things like that. But basically, the idea is that we feel that being vulnerable is actually a weakness,
Sure.
right?
Right.
And so I would like to present the idea, and I know we're coming around on this, we're coming full circle, that actually being vulnerable is very much a strength. But
Absolutely.
as a first responder, we don't learn that, right? We taught basically to disassociate. We see things that are very traumatic, and
Mhm.
we're told to act like that's completely normal, right? And to not take that home. And I mean, I'll even tell you, there's times that as a nurse as well, where I would go and want to talk about something, and that's just not appropriate at the dinner table, right? Like that's not something
Mm.
somebody who is not a first responder is going to want to hear. And we don't think about it not being a normal thing. But again, that just shuts us down as far as not wanting to even bring our work home, things that are very traumatic to us, maybe something we want to talk about in order to sort of process it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
it's hard when your spouse is not a first responder and doesn't understand, right? And so
I would really quickly, I would also say it is not willing to understand because, spouses can be not first responders, but I mean, there's a lot of spouses out there that are like, so tell me everything. And because we all watch true crime and everything else that's out there now, a lot of times we have spouses that are the exact opposite and they want to know it all. And it becomes part of the dinner table. And the first responder doesn't want to talk about it. Right. So it can go both ways.
go both ways.
Hmm.
Right. And so I would say learning to have a conversation about it as much as you are comfortable. And obviously, with
Yeah.
you have to keep HIPAA in mind, that kind of thing. We got to keep some things confidential, right? But learning to talk about it. And I think what I would recommend is that, again, first responders consider therapy to help develop that vocabulary. There's also some great programs out there. Love Brene Brown. She does the Atlas of the Heart. I think it's on, is it Prime or Netflix? One of those.
I think it's
That,
Netflix.
right. And it talks a little bit about these different, this vocabulary, this emotional vocabulary. I can't even talk to you. Emotional vocabulary, right? So there are resources out there. There are groups out there. There's different things out there that can help with that. And again, you're going to hear me say I really support therapy. I think therapy is great, especially if you have a provider who is or has been a first responder who does have this background. It makes it so much easier to have somebody to talk to.
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to completely explain every detail of a scene. I have had stories from clients where they told me that they talked to a clinician and that clinician broke down during session when they were talking about something that
Sure.
happened. So this is why I do, like I said, I highly recommend looking for clinicians who have this background. It makes it easier to have those conversations. And also for me as a therapist, I tend to integrate interventions that don't feel like interventions, right? Because
Sure.
I don't want to feel like I'm in therapy and somebody's talking down to me, or, I don't want that either. So I understand. And I think that these pillars, right? Being able to communicate and strengthen our family bonds through that communication, and then also having that vocabulary to talk about it, can really help with this balance, this overall balance, right? But again, it starts with knowing ourselves, what we need, and being able to express what we need.
What do you think is the challenge in people getting started with this?
I think the challenge is it's actually finding the time to sit down with yourself and be honest and have an honest conversation about what you need. And again, this is why I said a lot of people either don't have or make the time for that. And that's why I recommend having a therapist guide them through that, because I think a lot of times, and at least I know I can say too for myself, I probably without therapy, I was just on autopilot, right? I think a
Yeah.
lot of us are on autopilot. We get up, we do what we need to do, we go to work, we come home, we're tired, we do it over and over and over again. Where are we actually making time to sit down and think about what we need or what our goals are, or right? These
Yeah.
it feels out of place with our day-to-day life. And that's why I encourage therapy, because I think a lot of times a therapist will give you that space. They'll hold that space for you, and
Perfect.
they'll help you, guide you through that process.
Very cool. If people wanted to get a hold of you, how do they get a hold of you to make contact?
Great. Multiple ways. You can reach me either on my website, which is www.mindforgetherapy.com, or Mind Forget Therapy, if you'd like that.
Not mind forget it. I'll drop that in the show notes for sure. It will be correct.
And what's so funny is I always joke, I have made that joke myself about Mind Forget Therapy, because honestly, I mean, come on, I am middle-aged. There are times where I'm just like, right? And so anyway, yes, I think that's a very appropriate, another name for my company. They can also reach out to me at 253-398-9565. I do have a business line. They can call, they can text me, and they can also email me at info@mindforgetherapy.com.
And what state are you in? I forgot to ask.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm in Washington State.
Washington State, that's right.
I serve all of Washington State, and how I do that is virtual right now. Eventually, we'll probably have an in-person spot, mostly because, like I said, I'm in the middle of getting my couples certification. So I feel like couples is something that I like to have in person versus virtual. But anyway, that's all in process. And yeah, they can also find me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. So
Okay.
I'll get some wisdom on there too. So, get a little freebies if you guys come on Facebook.
Very good. Thank you so much for not just sharing your story and your journey, but also this idea of moving balance to being a couple activity and not just an individual activity. I can definitely see how that helps the intimacy and the connection and the support that we need as first responder couples. And I think that's a great concept for everybody to integrate. I had to find my word, to integrate into their relationship. So thank you, Elizabeth, for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
All right. And until next time, guys, y'all keep it Code 4. Bye-bye. I just want to thank Elizabeth again for coming onto the podcast. I think she gave some really great information in regard to that balance does not have to be a personal standpoint. Yes, there is an idea of knowing yourself, but also communicating with your spouse. I just felt like she also moved us into elements of the book. If you've not picked up my book, Hold the Line, The Essential Guide to Protecting Your Law Enforcement Relationship, what you don't know is there are 2 elements in there, actually 3 elements in there that she talked about that I have included in the book, which includes information and research about what the Gottmans did, John and Julie Gottman, and the research that they have in regard to relationships. There's a chapter in there about courage and vulnerability, which is based upon Brené Brown's research. And so the idea that it's not, courage is actually what's uncomfortable, right? So when you walk into something scary, that is the courage. And it takes courage to say you need help. It takes courage to talk about feelings and hard stuff. And yet that's really what's going to keep our relationships safe. She also talked about values, which if you have not gotten the book or if you have not downloaded my workbook, which is free, by the way, go to holdthelinebook.com and there is a free workbook on there that has a relationship compass. And that relationship compass asks both of you to talk about your values and then talk about it as a couple And what do you want those values to be? And how do you enact them to keep your marriage and your relationship on track and steer the right course? I think of it like a ship. So you're steering the ship, and your values keep you focused on where you want this relationship to go outside of law enforcement. Because when you retire, you're going to be there. And if you have not paid attention to your relationship, it's going to be a hot mess. So pay attention to it now. It's just small, steady adjustments along the way. So if you would like to pick that up, you can go to holdthelinebook.com. My book is available on Amazon as well, and the free guide is on my website. I hope this podcast has been helpful for you to understand a little bit more about how to balance your personal and professional life. With our relationship, we have a unique perspective of that. And I know many of you are dual career, and many of you have a professional life at home. You kind of have that professional mom status, is the way I say it. So make sure that you're having those conversations and keeping a good balance in your relationship, keeping your family and your relationship in your focus and your values in your path. And until next time, guys, I hope that you all keep it Code 4. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about the podcast or Cindy, check out code4couples.com. All intellectual property rights owned by CRLD2 Ventures, LLC, are protected by the firm of 9mm, 45 ACP, 5.56mm, and 12 gauge.